Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
All right, welcome to Liquid, New Hampshire. I have on as my guest today, Gennady Stolyarov II, the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Nice to meet you, Gennady. How are you doing today?
Pleased to meet you as well, Dominic. I am doing well and looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. One of the reasons I brought you on today is because I consider myself a transhumanist, and I sort of got introduced to these ideas before getting involved in politics. And then when I entered into politics, I found that a lot of the people on the left, which is where I tended to sort of find myself, were not a big fan of transhumanism. And so part of the reason I'm making the video today is to maybe introduce more people on the left to transhumanism who at the moment are kind of a bit more closed off to it. So, one of the things I wanted to ask up front is the Transhumanist Party's goals and platform. How much do you think it aligns with existing values of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or how do they compare to existing political parties?
So the U.S. Transhumanist Party stands for putting science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. And I think that does actually align with the values of a lot of people in both the Democratic and the Republican parties. It's interesting to observe this because American politics has become so polarized, so acrimonious, especially over the course of the past decade, and even more so over the course of the 2020s, really since the start of the COVID pandemic. But polls have consistently shown that despite the major policy differences and differences on the issues of the day between Democrats and Republicans, most Americans, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents, tend to align on seeing some good arising out of technological progress. There are some exceptions, both on the right and the left. On the right, the exceptions tend to come from, let's call them the alt-right conspiracy theorists, the Alex Jones types who like to cast transhumanism as some nefarious conspiracy among global elites. I can definitely tell you that's not the case. On the left, the animosity tends to come toward transhumanism from, let's call them the back to nature or neo-Malthusian types who see problems with technological progress and alleged resource constraints, which I would also say are not really the case. But among, let's say, more mainstream Democrats and Republicans, there's not really an aversion toward technology. These people use technologies, including emerging technologies, on a day-to-day basis. And they're not opposed to progress in medicine. They're not opposed to progress in computation or AI or space travel, though they may have different views about any regulatory frameworks and the extent of regulation that should apply to technological progress. But I think the overarching promise of transhumanism can speak to people from across today's political spectrum. This is why the Transhumanist Party does not consider itself to be left-wing or right-wing. It seeks to transcend that distinction, and it considers itself to be upwing. So we are in favor of any advancement and any policies that would contribute to the overall progress of humanity, which means people would get to live longer, higher quality, healthier lives of greater material prosperity and abundance and opportunity. And we would like to see those kinds of outcomes apply to as many people as possible. I think that's where we could, in principle, have a lot of alignment with people on the left, for instance, people who care about those who are currently poor or those who are currently marginalized, who don't have as many opportunities. Well, transhumanism can provide opportunities for them, empowering them as individuals by giving them access to technologies, by giving them access to better healthcare, greater longevity, so that they could self-actualize in ways that they would like and dramatically improve their lives.
That's a great answer. I like that phrase you used, upwing, too. That's nice. That's a good way of getting it across, I think. I know when I had first started researching the different third parties, right? I was trying to look into how can I approach people in my home state with all of these options outside of the Democrats and Republicans. And at first, when I found out about the Transhumanist Party, I wasn't super interested in it because I assumed that the policy stances of the party were going to be pretty much the same as maybe the Libertarian Party. I was expecting a lot of like deregulating tech. I expected that to be the only thing on the platform, really. And so in my mind, I was like, as much as I am a transhumanist, maybe this is not a political question. And then I actually read the party platform, and I was surprised to see things like an endorsement of increased NIH funding, for example. One thing I wanted to ask you about is what are sort of the possibilities you see for what the US government can do to fund technological progress in the near future?
Indeed, the US Transhumanist Party does support increased NIH funding. Hopefully, it will be put to good use. And I know right now there are some doubts with the appointment of someone like RFK Jr. as the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. So I understand that caveat. But in practice, the NIH does fund a lot of basic research into human aging, the biology of human aging, that probably wouldn't get funded by the private sector. And to the extent that that worthwhile science continues, of course, we in the Transhumanist Party very much support that, but we would like to see a lifting of some of the barriers that happen, some of the incentives that lead the allocation of NIH grants to be overly cautious, overly focused on kind of sure things, projects that aren't particularly ambitious, but they're likely to realize some sort of incremental result. Now, we are very enthusiastic about a program such as ARPA-H, and indeed, we are aware of some genuine longevists, people who want to overcome aging, being appointed as program managers of ARPA-H. That includes our friend Dr. Jean Hébert, whom I have interviewed previously on one of our virtual enlightenment salons for the Transhumanist Party, and I've met with him, I've spoken with him. He has a very ambitious vision toward essentially incremental replacement of tissues of the human brain as a way of combating brain aging. So ARPA-H is intended to be essentially a parallel to DARPA in being a bit less shackled in terms of how it can allocate funds, what sort of research it could pursue. So we're very optimistic about that. And in terms of other approaches, the Transhumanist Party supports a universal basic income. This universal basic income is not going to be funded through raising taxes. It's going to be funded through a proposal called the federal land dividend, where a lot of the land that is currently unused, that is not comprised of national parks or national forests or landmarks that we would want to preserve, could get leased out to companies in exchange for those companies essentially paying into a fund, kind of analogous to the Alaska Permanent Fund, which uses Alaska's oil revenues to pay its citizens essentially an annual amount ranging from a few hundred to a few $1,000s. So that's another way in which we think there could be a government program that helps people, but it's not a government program that's going to cost ordinary people anything more out of pocket than they're paying right now. And then during the early pandemic, the Transhumanist Party actually supported a significant array of health expansions, interventions into the healthcare system that were intended to build out our infrastructure, our capacity, because hospitals were overcrowded at that point, and the Transhumanist Party saw the need to more than double the hospital capacity in the United States. So we were advocating for a rapid hospital construction program similar to what had been undertaken in China, except it would be a permanent expansion. Unfortunately, since we are not a major political party, our proposal kind of fell on deaf ears. But nonetheless, if we had gotten our way, we would have twice as many, at least, hospital beds in this country right now. There would be a lot of hospitals that would be constructed that would have a mandate to operate whether or not they generated a profit. So there are many underserved areas in this country, rural areas, where it's very difficult for people to get healthcare. Sometimes there are certain parts of Nevada where I live where somebody who needs top-notch healthcare or specialized healthcare needs to travel for about 2 hours in order to reach a hospital. And we would have solved that problem with our proposal. Unfortunately, it seems like the established special interests prevailed there because it's often the case that an existing hospital corporation wants to have a monopoly over a particular area, and it imposes these certificate of need laws, which essentially require an approval for the construction of a new hospital to be given by a board comprised of representatives of existing hospitals. Well, how do you think they're going to decide in that case? So the Transhumanist Party's approach is actually distinctive from either of the major political parties or from the libertarians. The libertarians would just say, get completely out of the way, government shouldn't do anything. The Transhumanist Party says there could be a role for government for affirmatively building things and creating things and funding research. But government should get out of the way in terms of any barriers placed to innovations, sources of delay, or sources of what we would consider to be hyper caution. So we would support streamlining the FDA regulatory process. And we have a range of perspectives from our members. Some would support abolishing the FDA entirely. Some would support moving to what is called best choice medicine, which has been tried in other countries such as Japan, where perhaps a drug or therapy or device could pass safety trials, and then marketing of it would be permitted with the aim of gathering data in regard to efficacy, so that we don't have to wait, and patients who sometimes have serious illnesses or life-threatening conditions don't have to wait until 10 to 15 years have passed and that treatment has passed efficacy trials. They could benefit from it right away, and that could be very useful clinical experience that is actually more reliable than clinical trials that are often, let's say, conducted in artificial settings. They may not represent how patients in the real world actually interact with these medicines or devices or therapies. So the Transhumanist Party tries to be nuanced about this. We try to look at each particular policy, including possible government interventions, and say, well, how is this going to contribute to human longevity and health? Is this going to accelerate progress, or is this going to slow progress down? And that's how we make our decisions. But we try not to be doctrinaire about it. So there may be some in the Libertarian Party who would say, well, we don't care what the outcome of this policy is going to be, just on the basis of some set of principles, we're going to say, no, we don't want government intervention here. And I would say right now that is a bit of a short-sighted approach, because we have a certain time window, let's say the next 12 to 30 years, in which we would like to have longevity, escape velocity attained in time for our generation to benefit from it. And pragmatically speaking, we need to use every possible means to achieve that. And then we will have hopefully all the time in the world to devise the optimal policy framework.
Hmm. So is that you use the term longevity escape velocity, and towards our generation specifically, is it? Do you guys believe typically that it is that close?
I tend to align with Dr. Aubrey de Grey, whose work I have been aware of for now more than 20 years and with whom I'm actually collaborating since I'm a member of the board of directors of his newest organization, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. So the probabilistic prediction that Aubrey de Grey has made is that we're about 12 to 15 years away with a 50% probability of reaching longevity escape velocity, which means by that time, therapies of damage repair will be available to reverse, to some extent, each of the 7 major categories of damage that Aubrey de Grey outlined within his SENS approach. And SENS, to those who don't know, stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. Now, this is a probabilistic prediction. So it may be that it'll take a little longer. It may be that it will arrive a little bit sooner. Aubrey does provide the caveat that he thinks there's at least a 10% probability that we won't get there for 100 years, but still an 80 to 90% probability of getting there this century, for instance, is well worth pursuing. And I am hopeful that we have a fighting chance of getting there before our generation becomes too senesced. So my hope is sometime, let's say in my early to mid 50s, I would be able to avail myself of some treatments that reliably reverse certain aspects of biological aging. And that's important because the younger you are, the more effective those treatments are going to be. If you're 90 years old and at death's door, it's hard to do very much to repair damage in a meaningful way, though emergency medicine is also advancing and there are ways to keep older patients alive for longer. But this is a time when we should really be pushing for these advances because I do think unless humankind destroys itself in a nuclear war or there's a major asteroid impact, these advances will come eventually. But the question is, will they come in time for us? And Aubrey's timeframes have shifted over the years as well. So he originally said in the early 2000s that we were about 30 years away, again, with that probability estimate. And during the 2010s, actually, his time frame advanced more slowly than the passage of time because he didn't think enough resources were devoted to the field. That started to change in the late 2010s through 2021 when a lot of investment poured into the field and longevity became much more recognized. There was more media coverage, more people became interested in the field. At present, there is more funding. Sometimes that funding is not as well allocated as it should be because with more exposure also comes more hype. So some people think just through healthy lifestyle, they could reverse their aging and maybe they could give themselves 5 to 15 years, 15 years at most, but they're not going to live to 150 solely through healthy lifestyle. And what we want is an open-ended, indefinite lifespan. That requires advancements in biomedical rejuvenation technologies, and that is what the Transhumanist Party is advocating for.
That's funny because that sort of leads me to one of the common criticisms I hear is a lot of people lump together some, I don't remember his name, but there was a man who was all over the magazine, the man who would live forever, talking about, he just wants to take like supplements and exercise a lot, and he thinks that he personally will live forever. And in my eyes, that's maybe not the point or the goal so much as just placing an emphasis on, hey, this is going to come eventually. We need to make progress towards this. And even if it doesn't affect me personally, I would like, it wouldn't I would be happy if my kids could live forever. You know what I mean?
Yes. I think we need to be concerned about the future of humanity as a whole. And I do personally want to live forever, but what we're doing in the Transhumanist Party is we are helping to advance this area of scientific inquiry and technology and the policy framework surrounding it by advocating for the researchers, advocating for the visionaries who envision a better world for humanity. So I would say those interests are aligned. And unfortunately, some people are not going to make it to longevity escape velocity. Of course, they do have a backup option. It's called cryonics, which the Transhumanist Party also advocates for. And with cryonics, of course, it needs to be much more widely adopted. And in order for it to be more widely adopted, there needs to be progress in both techniques of cryopreservation and techniques of revival from cryopreservation. So that is also an area of great interest for the Transhumanist Party. But ultimately, we want as many people as possible to benefit from these advances. And we think it's worthwhile for everybody to participate in order to bring that kind of future closer. Every day that passes, about 150,000 people die in the world, and about 110,000 of them die from causes related to biological aging. So if the advancement of these treatments, if the arrival of longevity escape velocity are hastened by even a day, we would save 110,000 lives, and multiply that by 365 to see the impact in a year. It's quite tremendous, I would say. And I think it's worthy as a humanitarian pursuit as well. But I would say there can be a confluence of motives there. So people who want to live longer personally, people who want to help humanity or help posterity, they all have a common cause in this transhumanist movement. As long as we're moving in the right direction, that is what matters.
That actually leads me also to one of the sort of leading concerns with this worldview is there's a big religious criticism. You mentioned earlier Alex Jones. His belief is very much a religious one. He sees transhumanism as a sort of satanic false idol, as an evil machine god that to replace the real God. I've heard a number of religious thinkers on the left even recently pushing back against transhumanism from the same sort of Christian left perspective. How do you speak to people who have a religious concern about transhumanism?
I would say transhumanism is not inherently anti-religious, though a lot of transhumanists are atheists, and that would include me personally. There are also religious transhumanists. Micah Redding, who is a friend of mine and a great supporter of ours, is the head of the Christian Transhumanist Association. There's also the Mormon Transhumanist Association, which is run by Carl Youngblood, and another prominent individual in that association is named Lincoln Cannon. And the Mormon Transhumanist Association is actually one of the largest transhumanist organizations, and they're very sincerely, very thoughtfully religious. I don't think anybody could accuse them of being irreligious. There are many Jewish transhumanists, Buddhist transhumanists, some Muslim transhumanists. So transhumanism is compatible with the theologies of major religions properly interpreted. For instance, I have met Catholics who have been in favor of radical life extension because it would enable them more time to do good works in this world. And again, I say, to the extent that we are incrementally aligned, we want to push forward human progress, achieve the betterment of the human condition, longer, healthier lives. There really is no conflict. Now, there are some people who will claim that transhumanism is opposed to their religious teachings, but I would say that's less inherent to their theology and is more a kind of status quo bias, because historically, a lot of institutional religion has evolved, of course, as well, but it has been a lagging indicator of general cultural attitudes, about 30 to 40 years behind the cutting edge of advancement. So, for example, in the 18th century, there were some forward-thinking individuals, Quakers, Shakers, some radical Protestants who were anti-slavery on principle. But the religious mainstream at the time was pro-slavery and was citing evidence from the Bible saying, well, all of these great biblical figures, they own slaves. Slavery is natural and normal, therefore, and sanctioned by God. And it took people who were outside of the status quo mentality to challenge slavery. And over time, throughout the course of the 19th century, essentially all the major religious denominations came to reject slavery and consider it contrary to the word of God. So how did that happen? I think the problem isn't so much religion, it's status quo bias. And the status quo bias, it exists among both religious and secular people alike, because among many secular critics of transhumanism, one hears arguments like, oh, we need to respect nature and transhumanism is unnatural, or the world is going to be overpopulated or is going to run out of resources, or we are all stardust and we will just return to being stardust, so it doesn't really matter. Or they would just say immortality is a delusion of the religious. So these people are short-sighted as well. They're just as short-sighted as the religious critics of transhumanism. What they don't see is that the present is already radically different from the past, and the future is going to be radically different from the present, and the pace of change is accelerating. Now, this could be good change or it could be deleterious change. It depends on what we humans do to affect that change. However, the situation isn't going to be stagnant. So assuming that whatever the present status quo is normal and natural, and some future technological advance will be a departure from that, is not necessarily founded. Because if you think about it, those same religious critics of transhumanism, they accept travel on trains, even though that was considered unnatural in the early 19th century. People were making arguments like, oh, it's against the will of God. It's unnatural to travel faster than a horse. Or anesthesia was considered unnatural because God meant you to feel pain. And now, of course, anybody, even a fundamentalist religious person who goes in for major surgery, will opt for anesthesia. Open heart surgery is accepted, even though it changed the situation dramatically. If you had heart failure in the 1940s or the 1950s, that was essentially a death sentence. And now there are so many ways to extend the life of a person with serious heart issues. So religions evolve too. Religious thinking evolves as well. And we're not out to deconvert people. So I think the religious critics of transhumanism can rest assured that we're not going to challenge them on the fundamentals of their beliefs. We would just ask them to recognize that in the course of human events and the progress or the change in our societies, their theological framework is actually a lot more flexible than they consider it to be. And perhaps the inflexibility stems from something else, not from the values that they hold.
Absolutely. This makes me wonder also, what is Transhumanist Party's relationship to like the concept of technocracy as a form of government? Because I noticed earlier you used the phrase upwing. When I think of the people who are generally sort of in the center and up, I think of the technocrats, not in the sense of just liking technology, but in the sense of relying very heavily on experts to sort of make the decisions about how our society should function.
I would say there is some value in what is considered to be technocracy, in the sense of the principle that the people who are most qualified, most knowledgeable to make a decision are the ones who should be making it, with the important caveat that this shouldn't infringe upon individual rights. And often there are cases where people who are experts in one area may be stepping beyond that into areas where they don't understand the implications as much. Actually, we were skeptical of the pandemic lockdowns to begin with, because even though the intent was to limit the spread of infectious disease, and I do think social distancing, especially early on during the COVID pandemic, was a very wise decision. Having a coercive lockdown created so many adverse economic and societal consequences, and consequences in the way that people related to one another. It generated so much anger, isolation, the pathologies that stemmed from that, that I would say on net, it was a deleterious decision, even if social distancing did save some lives. So the question is, how does one have the appropriate scope for a technical expert to make decisions which are indeed technical in nature, which that person is qualified to make, but at the same time, you respect the ability and the prerogative of individuals to lead their lives in the ways that they see fit, and take advantage of that knowledge and that information, but not be forced into doing so. So transhumanists do respect diversity of individual choice. And you could have a situation where a very well-functioning technological infrastructure is designed, but people have the option not to use it. For instance, the Amish, we would respect the right of the Amish to live in the way that they see fit. And they have internal decision-making processes for what technologies they choose to accept or reject. But the key is they actually do accept some of the technologies. They utilize a lot of today's healthcare system. So they might not utilize computers, but they will go to a hospital to get treated. And as a result, they live longer than their ancestors did. So technocracy, I would say, has its place. We don't want every decision to be made by majority rule, because the majority isn't necessarily knowledgeable about everything. But we do want to have a level of elected office holders who are responsive to the people, and we need to make sure that elections genuinely reflect the will of the people. Hence, we support electoral reforms such as ranked choice voting, proportional representation, the allowance of any party or any candidate who wants to get on the ballot to do so. We support more inclusive debates. We support fairer media coverage. And really, we think there's a greater role for democracy. There's also a role for an inviolate sphere of individual rights and individual choice, which should not be infringed upon, whether one is in the majority or in the minority. So there are really three layers of decision making. On particular technical matters, we do need technical experts. In terms of a broadly representative government, we need a well-functioning democracy where people actually get to choose who represents them. And then there's a sphere of individual choice, which can draw upon any of that and utilize any of that. But the individual there is sovereign, whether or not they make good decisions, by the way. But we would hope through culture, we influence them to make good decisions.
So I know that in recent years, you guys did run a presidential candidate, Zoltan Istvan. Um, how did that campaign go? Do you feel that you guys were successful in what you were trying to accomplish with that campaign?
Well, in fact, we've run presidential candidates in every election cycle since 2016. And Zoltan Istvan was our first candidate in 2016. He also founded the Transhumanist Party. Then in 2020, we had Charlie Cam as our presidential candidate and Liz Parrish as our vice presidential candidate. And most recently, we had Tom Ross as our presidential candidate and Daniel Tweed as our vice presidential candidate. I would say every election cycle, we do achieve something in addition to the previous election cycle. So the first time around with Zoltan, it was mostly about publicity. And Zoltan had this Immortality bus tour. He converted an old 1978 RV into a coffin-shaped bus, and he traveled around the country, and he appended the first version of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights very briefly to the walls of the Capitol building, literally for a few seconds before the wind blew it away. But it was a kind of media opportunity, and he had a lot of articles written about that campaign. But the party didn't really have a membership base or an infrastructure at that time that had been established. And when I became chairman shortly after that election, I started to build up the party. So we had a bit over 1,000 members by the time of the 2020 election with Charlie Cam. And of course, given the pandemic, we had to run an entirely virtual campaign at the time, but we did reach a lot of people. And now in 2024, we had the Tom Ross, Daniel Tweed campaign, where we still face difficulties with ballot access. And that's where the duopoly has really built up formidable barriers. But our candidates did get a bit over 600 votes this time around. Again, we got some media coverage. And primarily, we have a huge amount of content that we've generated, both in terms of Tom's personal output, because he's a prolific writer and graphic designer, as well as in terms of our long-form discussion panels, our weekly virtual enlightenment salons, where we've delved into political issues as well as issues pertaining to the future of humanity, the advancement of science and technology. So we've done that every week at 1 p.m. Pacific time on Sunday, and we're going to continue to do that. So primarily, having a presidential candidate each cycle serves as, let's call it, a marketing opportunity for transhumanism, because people will often pay more attention to politics than they will to, say, academic conferences or research papers. At least there's a different audience that gets attracted by political coverage. So we're trying to make transhumanism more mainstream. Our goal is to make it a household term and make it be properly understood, not let the Alex Joneses of the world set the terms of the discussion. And I think we are achieving some of that. Of course, cultural transformation takes time. And we're chipping away at the institutional barriers, but also every day through our activities, we're spreading the word. And I think over time, that's going to continue to scale and build up momentum. We have about 4,600 members in the Transhumanist Party right now, and we want to keep growing. Membership is free, by the way. You can join at transhumanist-party.org/membership, and it takes less than a minute to join.
All right, I'll definitely join. Tom Ross's most recent campaign, in how many states were you able to get him on the ballot?
Well, we were trying to get him on the ballot in Louisiana and Tennessee, where the thresholds are a bit lower. Unfortunately, one of our main coordinators who was gathering petition signatures in Tennessee and his entire family fell ill with COVID right during the most critical weeks of gathering the signatures. So we felt short of the threshold, but I think that's a lesson for us to build up more of a grassroots network of organizers on the ground. Right now, transhumanism is still very much a movement that is geographically dispersed, where people coordinate online through conversations like the one that we're having, also through social media platforms, through email lists, through conferences. Sometimes people will congregate in a particular location, but mostly we opt for the low-cost digital option. But we still have to get more penetration, especially in the rural areas, areas which may not have as much of a tech sector, for instance, or just not as much population density. If you have more population density, probabilistically speaking, you're going to get a larger number of transhumanists. So unfortunately, a lot of states, when one is gathering petitions, either require the petitions themselves to have a proportional number of signatures based on the congressional districts, or a certain number of people who agree to be electors for a candidate. And one would need, for instance, one elector from each congressional district and then a few at-large electors. So if we have a very rural area in a particular state, it may be difficult to find a transhumanist in that area. So we really need to grow and broaden our network geographically in order to be able to get onto the ballot in many states, or advocate for lowering those ballot access thresholds, because as I've said, these are artificial thresholds set up by the duopoly, both Democrats and Republicans, for the purpose of keeping minor parties away from ballot access.
So that was Louisiana and Tennessee you said you struggled with. Did you get ballot access elsewhere, or?
Well, those are the states with the lowest thresholds that we identified.
Okay.
So Colorado used to be a promising option as well, because it was possible at one point in time, even 4 years ago, to just pay a fee of $1,000 and get 9 electors in Colorado and get onto the ballot. But the Democrats in Colorado caught wind of this and they made the requirements a lot more stringent. But really, in most states, one has to get thousands of petition signatures by hand. And that's the real restriction. It's not a very technologically friendly system, actually. And it speaks to the lengths to which the duopoly will go to keep any challengers away. But this is why I've said we don't really have a truly representative democracy in this country right now. We have an oligarchy. And this oligarchy has manipulated the rules through legal processes. I'm not saying they're breaking the law. I'm saying they have configured the law to be rigged in their favor.
Absolutely. Out of personal curiosity, right? I'm over here up in New Hampshire. Do you guys have chapters? Do you have a New Hampshire chapter of the Transhumanist Party or anything like that?
We don't have a chapter at this time. We used to at various points in time, but we do have a few transhumanists residing in New Hampshire, and we welcome people organizing state-level transhumanist parties in coordination with one another. I would say if anybody wants to organize a transhumanist party in New Hampshire, please let me know, and I will guide you through the steps.
Absolutely. I might have to reach out to you about that. I might need to find a couple of other people because at the moment I think it would just be me. But I might have to reach out to you about that. I think this one would be one I'd be interested in starting up. Mm-hmm. So I think we're nearing the end of the interview now. I wanted to ask you beforehand, though, what are some of the biggest points of information that you feel like people miss about the Transhumanist Party? What are some of the biggest takeaways you would want to leave an uninformed person with about the Transhumanist Party?
I would say there's a misconception that transhumanism is somehow elitist, and it's not. The vast majority of our members are middle-class individuals. So we're not actually a party of millionaires and billionaires. Sometimes I wish we had a bit more support from them, but they tend to go off on their own and do their own things and their own projects, and they don't really participate in grassroots organizations. We're a grassroots, all volunteer organization. Most of our members are middle class, so we generally represent people who have some sort of professional skill set and who do that in their daily lives, but they have an abiding interest in the future of humanity and in various emerging technologies, and they donate a lot of their time to the Transhumanist Party. And we also try to be maximally inclusive. So we have free events. We publish a lot of content online. Our weekly virtual enlightenment salon streams every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, or the various other interviews that we've done or articles that are available on our website at transhumanist-party.org. We've held virtual concerts. We've made available a lot of transhumanist artworks, including artworks made by generative AI. We have our non-political affiliate, which is called the Transhuman Club, and you can visit the website of that at transhuman.club. We have a discussion forum there, and we really want anybody to participate who supports a brighter future for humankind. We think money should not be a barrier. We try to run as many of our activities with no money at all, because we do see the digital age actually offering that as a great way to empower people and provide them with avenues to express themselves and engage constructively in the political discourse without this monetary barrier that a lot of people lament. So transhumanism is not elitist. We try to actually bring about the next era of humanity where there will be more opportunities and a brighter future for everybody. I would also say another misconception about transhumanism is that transhumanists somehow try to replace humanity. Actually, we seek to bring out the best in humanity. So historically, human beings have always strived to better their lives, to improve what they're able to achieve, how long they live, how well they live, but we have been limited by aspects of our biology or by insufficiently advanced technology or by our own cognitive biases, by certain irrational tendencies that exist in the human psyche. And transhumanism tries to overcome those limitations to bring out what is best in us as humans. But we want humans to continue to exist as individuals, and if possible, as biological entities, perhaps augmented by technology. But the vast majority of transhumanists, they want to stay as themselves. They just don't want to die. And they don't want to be subject to frailty and disease and disability. So we want humanity at its best, and we want to help as many humans as possible.
Absolutely. I should note that I personally am fine with doing away with humans. I'm pro robot, pro replace everybody with robots personally.
We're pro robots as well, but we think humans and robots should coexist. And if some humans have cybernetic parts or artificial parts, well, that's already happening. People have artificial limbs, artificial hearts, hearing aids that interface with their brains. So we are in favor of essentially the broadest range of sentient entities that can constructively interface with one another. That would include robots, artificial intelligences. If we come into contact with extraterrestrial life forms, we contemplate that outcome in our Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0. So we are for humanity continuing, but in this broader, let's say, pantheon of sentient entities that are hopefully all going to coexist and recognize one another's value.
Sure, yeah. So is there anything else you would like to plug before the end of the interview today?
I would encourage everyone to visit our website at transhumanist-party.org. We are also in the process of updating a transhumanist encyclopedia that has been in existence for a while, but I recently became the administrator of it, and it has been rebranded to THpedia. So TH stands for transhumanism, and it can be accessed at th-pedia.org, where it's essentially a wiki, so people can contribute their own knowledge, and we seek a comprehensive, objective database of information about the transhumanist movement, its history, key figures, and opportunities for people to get involved.
Absolutely, that's incredible. Well, thank you for coming on today, Gennady.
Thank you, Dominic.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to your latest episode of Futurologism. And today I have with us Gennady Stolyarov II, the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. So, Gennady, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Wenitte, for having me on this podcast. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I have led the U.S. Transhumanist Party for just over 8 years now, since November 2016. We stand for putting science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. I am a transhumanist, a proponent of radical life extension. I'm the author of Death is Wrong, which is the world's first and thus far only illustrated children's book on radical life extension. I am also a philosopher, an actuary, a composer, an amateur mathematician, and I generally consider myself to be a Renaissance man. So I don't define myself by one particular pursuit or one particular set of talents. I'm interested in the entirety of human endeavor and how it is interrelated and how it can help improve the human condition.
I love that energy. I love it. So, I guess my first question for you would be what drew you to transhumanism?
Well, I have been an implicit transhumanist since I learned about human mortality, and my children's book, Death is Wrong, describes that particular experience and how I had this immediate visceral reaction. This is unjust. People who have done nothing wrong should not be condemned to the ultimate penalty. However, for some time, I thought, while death should be defeated, the defeat of death would be in a further off future, the future of science fiction. Until in the year 2004, I learned about the work of Dr. Aubrey de Grey. At the time, Aubrey was working at Cambridge University. He had a website where I learned about the SENS approach. SENS stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. And Aubrey de Grey laid out a very persuasive case for why we don't need to understand all of the intricacies of human metabolism in order to be able to undo the principal types of cellular and molecular damage. And he identified 7 essential categories of such damage, which had already been known by that time for at least 20 years. At this point, they've been known for at least 40 years, and no new types of damage have been discovered since that time. Of course, there have been different taxonomies, different classifications of the same universe of aging related damage. But this ought to be encouraging because we don't have to necessarily tinker with the process that brings about that damage. Just every 10 or 20 years, we need to go in with comprehensive rejuvenation therapies and reverse that damage. And then we can become biologically younger as a result. That would give us time for more advances, and that would essentially set us on the path to what is called longevity escape velocity, where we stay ahead of this process of biological senescence. So when I learned about this in 2004, I realized, well, we have a fighting chance to defeat this great nemesis of death within our lifetimes. And even if it's not a certainty, and it's not, Aubrey de Grey's timeframes are probabilistic, we have it, I would say, as a moral imperative to try to do something about it, because the alternative is we resign ourselves to non-existence. So that definitely affected the trajectory of my life, and I went on to discover a lot more transhumanist writings. For instance, Ray Kurzweil's work. I read The Singularity is Near, and some of his earlier books, The Age of Intelligent Machines, The Age of Spiritual Machines. And I discovered the transhumanist community as well. So in some form, I've been involved in it for 2 decades now, and it has been a growing community, but it certainly needs to grow more in order to influence the mainstream society and get the kind of public support that we need to viably reverse biological aging within our lifetimes.
I'm curious to hear what do you think are the major barriers in place, like preventing the masses from accepting transhumanism?
I would say the main barrier is sheer unawareness. The fact is, transhumanism is not yet a household word, even though many people now in the media, in academia, and interestingly enough, among politicians know what transhumanism is. But why is it less accessible to ordinary people? I would say the main reason is life is hard and life is busy. So it so happens that our society is structured in such a way as to deprive people of leisure time, not because there aren't luxury goods, not because there aren't opportunities for entertainment. Indeed, compared to the former Soviet Union, where I grew up, luxury goods are cheap and accessible to the vast majority of Americans and other people in the so-called developed world. But what is actually, in some respects, less accessible, or at least very costly to obtain, are what I would call necessities, and in particular, housing, healthcare, and education. And those necessities take up the vast majority of most people's time, most people's resources, because I would contend those goods and services have been made artificially expensive by very bad policies over the past 50 years. And as a result, a lot of people are essentially on this metaphorical treadmill where they have to go faster and faster and faster in fulfilling their obligations in their jobs or in other ways in which they acquire resources just to afford those necessities. The luxuries, the entertainments, those are fine. Most people can afford them, but they don't have the time to engage with them. So it takes actually a very special set of people to be able to carve out the time for intellectual exploration. And I've been fortunate in my life, even though I'm not wealthy, to have structured it in such a way that I could seriously delve into ideas and essentially devote a lot of my time to the life of the mind, even though I'm as busy professionally and in many cases busier than most people are. However, I've made that concerted effort. Unfortunately, for many people, that's just not a possibility. And we do want to reach them. We do want to find creative, innovative ways for them to consider these ideas, to take them seriously. But if they're worried about the costs of housing and healthcare, that is still a challenge. And that's a challenge that we also need to strive to address as a political party, as the US Transhumanist Party.
Yeah, I've had a conversation with one of my friends before about transhumanism, and yeah, it is a philosophical movement, but it is also a political movement. Do you feel as if the goals of transhumanism are a bit like too abstract or like seemingly far in the future to connect to, like you mentioned, the day-to-day needs of people?
Yes, well, as William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And we have wonderful technologies, both long in existence and recently arrived. Generative AI is, of course, an example of the latter. Many of these technologies are actually not that expensive to access or utilize, but again, they require time and they require awareness. And I think one other issue that we have had, even relative to 20 years ago, is a hyper fragmentation of the media and information landscape. I remember the days of the early internet because I started out with my writing and my advocacy there. And the early internet was more of a kind of singular open space where everybody essentially could access the same resources. And the way you accessed a resource was you would type a URL, and many people did actually type the link into their browsers at the time. And it was sometime in the 2010s that people started telling me, well, nobody is going to do that anymore. Nobody is going to take 5 seconds to type a URL. You always have to get them to navigate to it with a single click. But these social media walled gardens, these platforms that were designed to keep people on them and essentially locked within some fragment of the internet, created a situation where something could be very prominent on one platform and almost nobody on another platform knows about it. Somebody could be an online celebrity in one corner of the internet, and almost nobody knows about them in another corner of the internet or in physical space. So this has resulted in a situation where communicating a message to a large audience has actually become more difficult, but we have better technologies to do it. We can create more interesting content, more advanced content. I remember when on YouTube, the main genre of video was essentially a person recording him or herself speaking in a similar manner as we're doing right now, the so-called talking head video. And that was state of the art around 2008 or so. And now we have such a greater variety of content, but at the same time, you could have an excellent piece of multimedia content, and it might spread on some platforms, but people on other platforms won't know about it. So that really is another challenge that we need to overcome. And I would say a diversity of approaches, a diversity of people within our movement can help bridge some of those chasms within the fragmented internet.
Thank you for bringing up generative AI. That actually leads us into another question I wanted to ask you. So, the party has been talking about AI for a while, like long before this current boom. I guess what are your thoughts on like the current systems we're seeing, and how do you think like what is the transhumanist contribution to the current AI policy discourse?
So, first of all, I think a lot of these systems are quite impressive. Most AI systems that have emerged into the public consciousness over the past 2.5 years have been large language models. And large language models, simply by processing vast amounts of data and finding correlations within the data and finding ways to alter those inputs into novel outputs, have been able to produce amazing results in terms of writing, in terms of art, in terms of music. We ourselves on the Transhumanist Party have used generative AI to create art and music that is inspired by the ideas of transhumanism. And we've broadcast it on our weekly virtual enlightenment salon streams every Sunday at 1 p.m. US Pacific time. So we see a lot of potential and also a lot of advancement over the time that those systems were around. I remember the DALL-E 2 outputs of art, for instance, they were still pretty impressionistic, pretty fuzzy around the edges, leaving a lot of room for interpretation, a lot of strange elements that had to be corrected via manual edits. And now when you see Flux or Grok 2 or similar models that were released just earlier this year in 2024, there's a lot more precision. They can not just generate convincing natural landscapes or other kinds of rough looking features. They can now generate buildings with symmetrical windows and architectural features that make sense, which I thought would take quite a bit longer. Likewise with music, I streamed just a week ago an AI Baroque grand concerto called the 52 Weeks, with 52 movements of Baroque music all generated by AI. And while I thought previously, well, AI could generate pop music fairly convincingly because it's simpler, but with Baroque or classical music, it would take a lot more development. And yet, music of those genres, while I would say it's still not equal to the great composers of history, is still quite good right now and quite enjoyable to listen to. And it will only get better. So that is, I would say, a set of tools that has created an artistic renaissance and, of course, has helped with communication. A lot of these generative AIs have been used to help people solve technical problems. They weren't very good at math in 2022, but in 2024, I gave ChatGPT 4.0 some advanced calculus problems that it previously aired on, or at least the prior version of ChatGPT aired on, and it solved them correctly, and it showed its work step by step. So progress is happening. But I am inclined to agree with Peter Voss in thinking that large language models are not a pathway to artificial general intelligence or AGI. They're still narrow AI. They're still tools, very powerful tools, that enable us to create content and also to broaden our own range of creativity, because by recombining elements from vast data sets, they can come up with outputs that human beings probably would not have originated themselves, just because they wouldn't have quite analyzed that space of content in the same way. So creativity is often just recombination of existing elements in novel ways. But that doesn't mean that these systems will be able to cross various domains of human endeavor on their own. So you could have a really proficient chess playing AI that beats every human, but it's not going to learn on its own how to drive an autonomous vehicle, and vice versa. A really safe, effective, proficient AI that can drive an autonomous vehicle really well, prevent almost all accidents, is not going to suddenly learn how to play chess or do backflips as some of the robots from Boston Dynamics have been able to do. Of course, you could create a system that combines multiple AI platforms into a suite of sorts. So you could have a Boston Dynamics robot with a ChatGPT interface and a text-to-voice interface, and say Wolfram Alpha for math, so that it becomes really proficient at mathematics. So you could combine a suite of AI models into something that presents itself as a multifaceted type of system. But still, it will only work in the domains where it was programmed to work. And you need an entirely different architecture in order to reach AGI. I still think that's about 20 years away. So I think Ray Kurzweil's time frame of 2045 for the AI technological singularity is a reasonable one. But of course, huge progress is being made in AI, and I think progress will be made on the path to AGI as well. I just don't think we're going to see it in the 2020s.
How do you envision society changing after the technological singularity?
Well, one aspect of technological singularities is that they are event horizons, and I've spoken about this before. We've seen 3 technological singularities, in my view, already as a species: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the information revolution of the mid to late 20th century. And some of the most forward-thinking minds of a given era can envision some possibilities in the next era. Like Leonardo da Vinci had designs for flying machines, but he could not have quite envisioned how commercial aviation unfolded during the 20th century. And he certainly would not have been able to envision computers or the internet or the kind of remote communication that we're engaging in right now. Henry Ford probably would have been baffled by social media. His mind just wasn't there. So in that future, after we have artificial general intelligences that can match or surpass human capabilities, some people today might have inklings of what that life would be like, what that experience would be like, but we can't quite see the whole picture. And I think sometimes people have the tendency to say, well, we'll keep everything else constant, everything else about our lives, our experience of the world, but this one thing is going to change. And that's, of course, not how the future unfolds. So I see this technological singularity as a convergence of technological advancements. And these will be, in addition to advancements in AI, advancements in our knowledge of biology and biotechnology and medicine and the embodiment of these AI systems and robots. So to really be autonomous participants in our society, they can't just be systems on supercomputers. They would have to walk around and interact with us in physical space. So there would be Android AGIs, essentially. We would have advances in space travel. Already there have been remarkable advances, many of them driven by Elon Musk and SpaceX. Hopefully we'll have settlements on other worlds as well. We will have different levels of technological adoption by societies and subcultures. Again, the future is already here, but it's just not evenly distributed. And as technologies advance, there will be more scope for choice as to which technologies people choose to adopt and which technologies some people choose not to adopt. Already, of course, there's a spectrum. Some people are early adopters of technology. Some people are laggards. Some people even today prefer not to use computers. There are Amish people today who reject a lot of technologies from the 20th century. And yet, even many Amish people will say, of course, we're going to use the medical system. We're going to go in for surgery if we have health problems, because they're not against all technologies. They just want to preserve a particular way of life, and they are reluctant to adopt technologies that conflict with that way of life. So one possibility that I see is actually a kind of hyper pluralism, a flourishing of diversity of lifestyles and choices unlike anything that we've seen. If people think that today's, let's say, challenges where there are different attitudes or different lifestyles, or some people might still experience clashes with regard to ethnicity or religion or gender, if they think that is a world of great diversity, they haven't seen anything yet. So at the point at which we have, say, many people with cyborg implants, people who have gotten various genetic enhancements through gene therapies, for instance, people who live longer, some people who have more strength, more endurance, more ability to achieve certain physical feats, we are going to have an extensive amount of diversity, and we are going to need to have a common foundation for a society that allows all of these beings, these sentient entities, to flourish, whether or not they're human, by the way.
That actually brings me back to Sens and your book, Don't Die. So you have this technological singularity as still decades in the future. What do you see as the most promising path to get to radical life extension right now?
So, in terms of my book, Death is Wrong, I advocate for a biomedical rejuvenation approach. So I actually have an appendix there for kids, by the way, about SENS and about the 7 different types of aging-related damage that Aubrey de Grey identified. I think there's a lot of need right now for more experiments in the lab. And this is an area where we need scientists at benches, essentially, doing studies in mice, doing studies in humans, doing studies in other organisms to see what interventions work, both individually and in combination, to extend lifespans significantly and extend markers of health as well. But those have to be studied over the course of an entire lifespan, not just, say, you have a finite duration of a study, like, say, 24 months, and then you see what data you collect. And unfortunately, in many cases for these studies, the mice or other experimental animals are euthanized afterward, solely based on considerations of cost or some completely irrational default protocol. You need studies that follow these animals to the very end and figure out how long can these interventions actually make them live. So along these lines, the LEVF, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, which is Aubrey de Grey's newest foundation, is doing great work with the robust mouse rejuvenation series of studies. The first one is getting close to completion, though there are still 11 very long-lived mice left out of 1,000 as we're discussing this right now. The second study is going to be launched very soon, and I think that's crucial to generate the data for the AI systems to analyze, because, of course, the AI systems can only derive insights from the material that they're given, from the information that already exists. And somehow that information has to be generated. So as the AI systems become very powerful, they're only going to be able to use their techniques on large volumes of data that were already somehow created or provided to them. So one reason why they are very effective with text or images or music is because huge amounts of that kind of content have been created. And of course, there have been many scientific studies, some better than others, by the way, some with more accurate data than others or superior methods than others. So we're going to need to do more good fundamental science to feed into the AI systems so that they can extract insights from that empirical work. But the need for more biologists, the need for more empirical researchers of every stripe, I would say has never been greater in order to facilitate those breakthroughs. And I would also say we are going to have more personalized medicine, more personalized health tracking. People will start to have a clearer idea of what is happening in their bodies in real time and be able to respond more rapidly. So you mentioned don't die. That's Brian Johnson's motto. And his point is essentially try to keep yourself alive for as long as possible using the techniques available today. That could be healthy lifestyle. That could also be through the use of technologies that help you identify and solve problems, because you want to stay alive for these upcoming advances. You want to make it to the technological singularity because the possibilities there for rejuvenating you are going to be a lot greater than the possibilities that exist today.
Yeah, uh, my thought on that. It is kind of late in my time zone at the moment, so got some terms mixed up. But so you are a Renaissance man, a polymath, and one of your disciplines is philosophy. If you feel comfortable sharing, I guess, what is like the most unique philosophical view that you hold?
I would say the most unique philosophical view that I hold, and this is an overarching view that motivates essentially all of my endeavors. I see humanity as being engaged in this war on the forces of ruin, as I call them. And I have an essay from 2012 called The Real War and Why Interhuman Wars Are a Distraction. So, in terms of my metaphysics and epistemology, I'm very closely aligned with many of the philosophers of the Enlightenment as well as with the objectivists. I'm not dogmatic in my views, but I do see fundamentally that there is an objective reality, that it is at its base a material reality, and that it is fundamentally comprehensible through human reason. I think in terms of ethics, I have this overarching concern with defeating the forces of ruin. And I think it is a moral imperative to do that. I am an individualist, ethically speaking, so I do think people should act in their own enlightened, best long-term self-interests, and there's nothing wrong with that. And people should try to live as long as possible. People should try to lead lives of as high quality as possible. But in terms of how do you spend your time, I would say fighting the forces of ruin is such a strong imperative in my view, and I see such a huge scope of problems caused by the forces of ruin in the world that we are going to be occupied in solving these problems for centuries, millennia, even longer. Even if Ray Kurzweil's time frame is correct, we reach the technological singularity by 2045. We can solve many of the causes of aging. We can live indefinitely. There is still so much work that will need to be done. We will need to figure out how to prevent natural disasters. We will need to prevent, say, asteroid impacts upon the Earth. We will need to colonize other worlds, expand throughout the galaxy, prevent the eventual destruction of our solar system or the eventual destruction of our galaxy. So these are objectives that are going to keep us busy for millions, maybe billions of years. I want to be around to experience that. But this war on ruin, I think, is an animating drive that I think all humanity properly should exhibit, and implicitly many people do every day when they do strive to secure the basic necessities of their lives when they strive to work at something, to achieve something. They're fighting against the forces of ruin. They're holding the forces of ruin at bay. But I think that recognition is not as explicit as it should be. And as a result, a lot of people engage in dissipative or suboptimal activities. And I want to essentially alert humankind that we need to redouble our efforts here.
Even if we do have radical life extension, I presume the human body is just going to deteriorate at some point. So I guess it's kind of a combined question. Like, what do you see as like the next step after humanity? Or do you see it as like we'll just keep rejuvenating our bodies? And what are your thoughts on mind uploading?
I would prefer a continuous rejuvenation of the human body, but of course, there could be incremental enhancements along the way. So we could figure out how to make our tissues more durable so that our bones don't break as readily. Or, for instance, our skin might become more resistant to UV radiation, or our organs could regenerate in ways that other animals already have the ability to do. And we just need to figure out how to trigger that capacity for regeneration in our own bodies. So all of that would be different from the capabilities of current humans. I would say, though, that with a combination of biomedical rejuvenation and that kind of enhancement, we wouldn't cease to be humans, and we wouldn't even cease to be biological humans, though, of course, in many respects, we could have cybernetic enhancements. We already do. There are pacemakers, there are hearing aids that interface with the brain. So those technologies will continue to develop. And I would say what humans actually use to supplement or, let's say, reset the clock on their biology is going to be more of a pragmatic consideration. What works better? Would it be gene therapy, some sort of biological organ replacement, 3D printing of an organ that could replace an organ that's failing, or could it be an artificial organ, an artificial part of some sort that might be better than a biological part? But I would say at every step along the way, it's important to preserve a continuity of some aspects of the human organism. So I have an essay about this from 2010 entitled, How Can I Live Forever? What Does and Does Not Preserve the Self? And in it, I very much argue for an incrementalist approach. So I am not a proponent of destructive mind uploading. I think if you upload a mind into a digital substrate, you're essentially creating a copy. And it would be like if a version of you that was identical, atom by atom, were 3D printed right alongside you. And let's say everything went exactly according to plan, and this person was an exact copy, but he was just a few feet away from you. And then he would go off having his own life, his own experiences, and you would no longer see the world through his vantage point. He would not see the world through your vantage point, though both of you would say you had the same memories, you had the same past. But this vantage point, what I call the I-ness, would differ between the two of you. And it would be the case with an uploaded mind as well. So I don't deny the possibility of a non-biological substrate being able to essentially host a mind that would be conscious, that would be an entity worthy of rights, an entity with agency. So you could have those uploads, but I think they would be copies. And I think preserving the original would still be important. Now, gradual replacement of the brain may be possible, and there have been scientists talking about incremental replacement of biological brain tissues. Jean Hébert, who was recently appointed as one of the program managers of ARPA-H, may actually have the chance to try out this approach in practice not too long from now. So I'm very interested to see how that line of research goes. But if you have a situation where, let's say, you can graft an artificial neuron onto a biological brain and it works, it interfaces with the rest of the biological brain, over time, it becomes integrated into that organism, essentially. And then you keep doing that over and over again. Maybe at some point in time, you will end up with an entirely artificial brain, but there needs to be this continuity over a long period of time between the biological brain and the eventual artificial brain. And all of the functions would need to kind of be gradually assumed by these artificial neurons. At the end of that process, maybe there won't be biological components left, though there could be. Again, maybe the biological components will be superior in some way, or biological neurons could be re-engineered in such a way that you could graft those on to the brain instead. But I would say, as long as you have the continuity of vantage point, the continuity of I-ness, that being is still going to be the same human. So we're not going to just be some totally different entity. I would say the goal is to preserve ourselves as individuals. I'm an individualist, so I want to be me in the future. Maybe my components are going to be different, but I want there to be a clear path from here to there without discontinuities.
That's the ship of Theseus paradox. I like that.
Yes.
Transhumanism is often classified under the broader post-humanism landscape, but it seems as if post-humanism thought is kind of diverging towards more imagining a future without humans. So I guess, how do you see that connection?
Yes, I would not consider myself to be a post-humanist. I think we are going to be transhumans in the sense that we will have more capabilities, fewer limitations than humans historically have had. But transhumans are still going to be human. And I'm also a humanist. So some post-humanists, especially academic post-humanists, will say that there's a need to transcend humanism, that humanism is somehow limiting. And I don't believe that. I think humanism is still important. Respect for basic human rights, human autonomy, self-determination are essential. And furthermore, the use of rationality, the application of rationality to solving problems, improving the quality of life, will remain paramount, no matter what our physical hardware is going to be. Now, I have also stated in the future there will be a diversity of sentient entities, not all of which will be human. And the Transhumanist Party, in its Transhumanist Bill of Rights, version 3.0, explicitly acknowledges this and tries to prepare our society for a future where rights would not be exclusively limited to humans. For instance, if we have sentient AGIs, or if we have uplifted animals, I think it may be possible. If it's possible to genetically engineer greater intelligence in humans, why not genetically engineer greater intelligence in other species of animals? If we make contact with extraterrestrial life forms, some people think there has already been some sort of contact. I'm a bit skeptical of that, but I'm open to evidence in this regard. But I would say if there is a possibility that we may encounter other intelligent life forms, we need a framework of rights, we need a framework of civil constructive interaction with them so that we don't end up in some sort of interspecies warfare, which is always counterproductive. So we will be a future of other entities that are not human, that are still sentient and sapient and worthy of rights. But I hope that future will have humans in it as well. I hope that future will have a broad spectrum of humans, ranging from people like the Amish, who might still be living in their communes centuries from now, to people who avail themselves of the latest technological breakthroughs and enhancements. And hopefully the Amish will participate in this future and utilize some of these technologies as well. Fundamentally, I hope they will accept longer lifespans so they could live on their farms, they could produce their craft furniture, ride around in their horses and buggies, but they'll live for hundreds of years. I want that kind of future, and I want a future where people can choose any place along that spectrum that they prefer based on their individual goals and aspirations and their values.
As the chairman of the party, for those listening who might not be sold on transhumanism or the Transhumanist Party's political goals, what would you say are the major reasons they should look deeper into it?
Well, the major reason to look deeper into the Transhumanist Party is that it offers a way out of this quagmire that American politics finds itself in. We have been so hyper-polarized, especially over the past decade, that we've literally had assassination attempts on presidential candidates. We've had violence in the streets. We were inches away from a civil war in this country, so it cannot continue that way. And the reason for this polarization is this duopoly in American politics utilizes a divide and rule tactic where the elites, in order to fight their own internal battles, polarize 50% of the population against the other 50%, generating these vicious hatreds that undermine everyday life and everyday relationships, family ties, friendships, what have you. And we need an alternative, a more constructive vision of the future. Unfortunately, the postmodern era in the 20th century eroded a lot of the sense of meaning that many people have historically had, the sense of purpose that they've had to work for improvements in their day-to-day lives. And because of postmodernism's rejection of absolute truth and meaning and attempts to deconstruct what were considered to be various flawed narratives, essentially many people were left adrift. And we have predominantly in the Western world a kind of culture of despair and nihilism and hopelessness and cynicism, and that needs to be overcome. Transhumanism offers ways to overcome the polarization, to overcome the meaninglessness and cynicism by, again, rekindling a confidence that technological and moral progress can uplift people, can improve living standards, the length of life, the quality of life, the amount of life spent in good health. All of those can be dramatically better than what exists today. And also, this war on ruin is very much a part of transhumanism. I think people often do need a common enemy to rally around, but we don't want that enemy to be other people because that can lead to a lot of meaningless destruction. We want that enemy to be what actually endangers human beings, and those forces of ruin, death, disease, decay, natural disasters, threats from outer space like asteroids. Those are the threats that can unite people. And it was mentioned before, sometimes people perceive transhumanism to be abstract, perhaps too detached from their daily concerns. But when framed as a war on ruin, I think the day-to-day concerns can be brought in as well. Whenever we work to improve our immediate surroundings, let's say there's a blighted neighborhood somewhere and people are trying to rebuild it. That, I would say, is also a transhumanistic endeavor. If you try to find cheaper ways to house people, that's a transhumanistic endeavor, particularly if you're using technology to do it. So I think there is a huge scope for large numbers of people to embrace transhumanism as the next paradigm of our civilization, to essentially replace postmodernism and the meaninglessness and cynicism that that paradigm has engendered with a more hopeful paradigm, a paradigm that people will be enthusiastic to work on behalf of.
What is your vision for the radical transformation of society?
Well, I would say the radical transformation of society will be one where people will live much longer. So hopefully we will be able to reverse biological aging within our lifetimes. Aubrey de Grey's probabilistic time frame is that there's about a 50% probability of reaching longevity escape velocity within 12 to 15 years. I hope that also the radical transformation of society will involve radical material abundance. So we talked about how housing, healthcare, and education are quite expensive right now in Western societies especially. I envision a future where they will be basically free. And free not because there's a law saying that they have to be free, but free because they will be so cheap to produce that you will be able to 3D print a house on the spot, that you will be able to have Star Trek-like tricorder technology that could diagnose and cure most afflictions, that you could learn anything you want to learn for free, which already is starting to happen in terms of education with online resources. It's just a matter of getting the people who need those resources to have the time and inclination and the awareness to utilize them. But I envision a future where we will have radical longevity, we will have radical abundance, we will have still accelerating progress, and people will recognize that this life is precious, that it can continue to get better, but we also need to keep fighting against the forces of ruin. So people will not just become lazy, people will not just become complacent because they have this radical abundance. People will realize we're still very fragile no matter how far we advance. We're dealing with cosmic threats now. We're dealing with threats across millions of years of history, and we need to prepare, and we need to enhance our intelligence and enhance our wisdom to be able to deal with ruin on that scale. So there won't be a utopia, by the way. So radically transformed society will also be a society of continuous transformation, continuous improvement. There won't ever be a time when we say we've arrived. Even after this technological singularity, it won't be like Francis Fukuyama's End of History, which he infamously posited when the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, it turns out history is back with a vengeance, and history is going to continue to unfold after the next technological singularity. There may be various other technological singularities beyond it. So it will always be a dynamic society, a dynamic civilization. I just hope that it is a civilization that embraces this transhumanist principle of boundless expansion that Max Moore and the Extropians wrote about in the 1990s. That's the kind of future I want to participate in.
That is quite the compelling vision. I'm ready to join your simulation.
Well, thank you.
Do you want to link to any of your socials or how to purchase your book, any website?
Absolutely. So Death is Wrong is my illustrated children's book on radical life extension. You can purchase it on Amazon, or you can go to my website, The Rational Argumentator, which is rationalargumentator.com, and you can get a PDF version of it in 5 languages: English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Russian. You can also find a lot of my other writings and musical compositions on the Rational Argumentator for free. Of course, please visit the Transhumanist Party website, transhumanist-party.org. We have a Facebook page called US Transhumanist Party. We have a Facebook group called Transhumanist Party. We are on X as US Transhumanist. We are also now on Blue Sky. Our account there is just called Transhumanist. And we are on Instagram as US Transhumanist Party. You can find me on Instagram as well. I post a lot of AI-generated and human-generated art there on my Instagram profile. So there are many ways to connect with me. Also, please do check out our Virtual Enlightenment Salon series. Those are on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/gstolyarov with 2 capital I's afterwards. So that's the first letter of my first name, my last name, followed by the second. Every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, we will stream a salon of about an hour and 53 minutes where we have intellectual conversations. We will also sometimes have virtual concerts or streams of video presentations about various aspects affecting the future of humanity.